Imagine a man walking through a forest, determined to avoid a certain tree. The more he avoids it, the more he finds himself circling back, drawn inexplicably toward it. This is not a mere quirk of fate, but a profound truth about the mind. The harder you try to avoid something, the more it haunts your every step. You might be surprised to hear that those who claim to avoid someone, to detach, to pull away, are often the ones most consumed by them. What seems like distance is, in fact, obsession dressed in disguise. This hidden fascination is not about the other person, but about what your mind refuses to face within itself. When we avoid, we aren't truly free. Our minds spin stories, create images, rehearse conversations, and build illusions around that person we insist we no longer care about. The obsession arises not because of who they are, but because of the parts of ourselves we deny: fear, longing, pain, or unmet desires. There is a curious dance between detachment and hidden attachment. We pretend to step away, yet our hearts remain tethered. This tension reveals the very nature of desire. It is not found in the other, but in the restless mind that tries to escape itself by fleeing from what it fears to feel. So why does this matter? Because recognizing this obsession is the doorway to understanding ourselves. It is only by shining the light of awareness on these hidden fixations that we can begin to unravel the knots of avoidance and find freedom. Freedom is not in running away, but in being present, in seeing clearly without the fog of illusion. Stay with me, and we will explore together how this paradox of avoidance and obsession holds a mirror to your own heart, and how embracing it can lead to a deeper peace than avoidance ever could. The moment you resolve not to think about someone, the mind, like a mischievous trickster, delights in bringing that very person into sharper focus. You tell yourself, "I will not consider this face, this name." And instantly the mind begins to spin images, replay conversations, revisit laughter and quarrels, as though drawn by an invisible magnet. Attempts at escape become the soil in which obsession flourishes. For avoidance is not a neutral act, but an energetic force that fuels the very thing it seeks to quench. In striving to push thoughts away, you engage in a tug of war with your own consciousness, and in every tug the rope of fixation tightens. The irony is that avoidance is an act of attention. It says, "I care enough to reject you." And caring, whether in affection or aversion, gives life to the focus you wish to extinguish. When you think, "I must stop thinking about this person," your mind sneaks behind your back and repeats the injunction until it reverberates endlessly. It is as if you shine a spotlight on the very thing you wish to hide, illuminating every detail in high relief. This paradox is rooted in the mind's tendency to polarize. By defining the person as the forbidden object, you elevate their importance to mythic proportions, and the higher you place them on a pedestal of prohibition, the stronger the gravitational pull becomes. Every attempt to move away from the thought makes it loom larger, like two magnets oriented to repel yet irreversibly attached. What unfolds is a relentless cycle. You recoil, the mind pursues; you resist, the mind obsesses. This dynamic arises from a fundamental misunderstanding of desire and aversion as opposites. In truth, they are two sides of the same coin, a coin minted in the workshop of the ego. The ego says, "I am separate from this person, I must protect myself." And in its protective fervor it arms itself with vigilance, awaiting every sign, every memory, every whisper of feeling. Vigilance is attention, and attention is obsession. There is no neutral stance in the architecture of the mind. To avoid is to acknowledge is to amplify, and to amplify is to dwell. If you were to observe this process without judgment, as a curious witness, you would see that the knot of avoidance unravels when you stop yanking on the end. By observing the fixation as it arises, without feeding it with the energy of resistance, you allow it to dissolve. Yet such witnessing requires a subtle shift, moving from the role of participant, enmeshed in the drama of avoidance, to that of silent observer, aware of the push and pull, but not swayed by it. For until you understand that avoidance itself is a form of attention, you remain locked in a battle that only the mind can win. Endlessly chased by the reflection of its own resistance, the person an avoidant is obsessed with is not always the one who loves them the most. It's often the one who touched a part of them they were most afraid to reveal. You see, obsession doesn't come from logic or compatibility. It comes from disruption. It comes from someone who, without trying, unsettled the controlled emotional equilibrium that an avoidant person builds to survive. That person becomes a mirror not of comfort, but of exposure. In their presence, the avoidant is seen, and not just in the flattering light of admiration, but in the raw glare of vulnerability, and that is terrifying. So they retreat. They shut down, detach, disappear, not because the other person did something wrong, but because they touched something true. And the ego cannot bear too much reality at once. Yet despite the withdrawal, the connection lingers like smoke in the lungs. The very act of avoidance becomes the seed of obsession because it's tied to unfinished emotional business. The mind fixates on what it can't fully process, and when feelings are left unexplored, they ferment. The avoidant psyche, which fears engulfment and intimacy, also yearns for it in secret. So a paradox is born. The person they push away becomes the person they think about most, not because of who that person is in reality, but because of what they symbolize. They are the embodiment of emotional freedom, of depth, of intimacy unfiltered. And though the avoidant cannot fully engage with it, they cannot forget it either. This obsession isn't romantic in the traditional sense. It's often silent, secretive, and internal. It may not even be conscious. It shows up in dreams, in moments of stillness, in sudden waves of memory. The face appears when least expected. The voice echoes without warning. And all the while, the avoidant pretends they feel nothing, insists they've moved on, lives on the surface of life while the undercurrent pulls toward that unresolved connection. The obsession becomes a ghost, not one that haunts out of malice, but out of meaning. A ghost that signifies something left unsaid, unfelt, incomplete, and the avoidant, despite their defenses, is drawn to that ghost again and again, not because they want to suffer, but because part of them is still trying to understand what happened and, more importantly, what it meant. And so the obsession grows, not from love alone, but from the emotional impact that person had on the avoidant's inner world. That impact might have been brief, even fleeting, but it left a mark, a crack in the wall, a softening in the armor. And in the quiet moments of solitude, the avoidant doesn't miss the person so much as they miss the version of themselves they briefly became in that person's presence, open, connected, alive. The mind is a master storyteller. It weaves narratives not to reflect reality, but to protect the self from discomfort. When an avoidant becomes obsessed with someone, it isn't always the person. They're fixated on the story their mind has built around them. And what a compelling story it is! That person becomes larger than life, an icon of lost opportunity, a symbol of emotional danger, or the representation of love that was too much, too soon. The mind, in trying to make sense of why that connection felt overwhelming, creates myths. They were too intense, they wouldn't understand me, it wouldn't have worked anyway. And yet, even as it constructs these narratives, it keeps returning to the image, the voice, the memory of that person again and again, as if something in the story remains unfinished. This is the illusion of control. By rewriting what happened, by convincing themselves that the disconnection was necessary, rational, inevitable, avoidance seeks safety. But the emotional truth doesn't disappear just because the intellectual version has been rewritten. It lingers in the background, questioning the validity of the story, and so the mind must keep reinforcing the illusion. It replays old scenes, changes the tone of memories, reframes the way things ended. This constant internal revision becomes a quiet obsession, a loop of inner dialogue aimed at justifying the distance while secretly clinging to the connection. And yet, every time they revise the story, the emotional imprint becomes clearer. They remember not just what was said, but how it felt, that moment of closeness, the look in the other person's eyes, the sense that someone saw beneath their defenses, and with each remembrance, the narrative begins to crack. The illusion of detachment grows thin. The story stops serving its purpose and starts becoming a burden. It no longer offers safety, it becomes a cage. You see, obsession in the avoidant mind is not about desire in the way we typically understand it. It's about mental preoccupation, emotional defense, and unresolved meaning. The mind creates stories to avoid vulnerability, but those very stories keep the person trapped in the energy of the one they're avoiding. Every attempt to explain it away becomes a tether to the past. The more they try to close the book, the more the pages seem to turn on their own, and the person they claim to avoid, the one who lives in those mental stories, becomes a character not in their life, but in their mind's theater. A phantom of significance, shaped as much by fear as by love. They are obsessed not with the real person, but with the unresolved feelings that person awakened. Feelings the mind cannot bear to sit with directly, so it crafts a tale instead, but that tale, no matter how well told, never truly ends. There is a peculiar rhythm to emotional avoidance, a dance of coming close and pulling away, of reaching out then vanishing, of saying just enough to feel something and retreating before feeling too much. But what few realize is that behind this pattern lies an invisible thread of deep attachment. The avoidant is not detached at all, rather they are overwhelmed by the intensity of feeling, and so they hide, not because they don't care, but because they care too much in a way that feels unsafe. The very thing they run from is the very thing that draws them in, emotional intimacy, and the person who makes them feel most exposed becomes the one they think about most, not because that person did anything extraordinary, but because they stirred the still waters where the avoidant had buried their most vulnerable self. In the presence of that person, the avoidant may have felt seen without effort, understood without explanation, and connected without needing to try. That kind of emotional resonance is rare, and for someone whose nervous system is wired for self-protection, it feels dangerous. So they pull away, sometimes abruptly, often without closure, leaving the other person confused and themselves unsettled. But the story doesn't end with the withdrawal. In fact, it only deepens. The avoidant may silence the phone, block the contact, change routines, but inside, a storm brews. The mind returns again and again to that person. They wonder what they're doing, who they're with, if they've moved on, if they still think about them. This is not detachment. This is preoccupation hidden beneath the surface. The emotional dance continues internally. They try to rationalize the distance. I'm better off this way. They wouldn't have accepted the real me. It wasn't meant to last. Yet none of these stories quiet the deeper unrest. Because deep down, the avoidant knows they ran not from the person, but from what the connection revealed, their own longing. Longing to be close, to be safe, to be held. And that longing doesn't disappear when they push someone away. It buries itself deeper, like a fire burning quietly under the earth, smoldering until a thought, a memory, a scent reignites it. Suddenly they are back in the feeling again, not in reality, but in recollection. Obsession takes root here in the emotional residue that avoidance never cleared. The avoidant is often unaware of this loop. They believe they've moved on. They tell themselves they're fine. But the signs are subtle and persistent. Dreams, sudden waves of emotion, moments of grief without a clear source. These are not accidents. They are signals, proof that what was pushed down has not been let go. And the person who triggered this internal shift becomes an emotional landmark, someone they orbit quietly, from a distance, even as they deny their own gravitational pull. Desire is a strange thing. It rarely points where we expect. For the avoidant, desire doesn't announce itself boldly. It hides in the shadows, masked as silence, disguised as indifference. But beneath that cool surface is a deep yearning, not necessarily for the person themselves, but for the version of reality that person represents. The obsession arises not from who the person is, but from what the avoidant feels in their presence: safety, aliveness, possibility. And because these feelings are rare, the mind captures them, stores them, replays them like a sacred film. The avoidant does not return again and again to the person. They return to the feeling state, that person awakened. This obsession, then, becomes less about the other and more about the self. It's not the person they can't let go of, it's the reflection of their own emotional depth they experienced while with them. The problem is, this depth is frightening. It is not part of the carefully controlled emotional environment the avoidant has constructed. So they suppress it, but whatever is suppressed gains weight in the unconscious, and as it accumulates, it starts to leak through memory, fantasy, fixation. The person they avoided becomes a symbol, a key to a part of the psyche long sealed off. And here lies the paradox. The more the avoidant tries to suppress these emotions, the more powerful the obsession becomes. Because desire isn't fueled by possession, it's fueled by absence. And nothing creates absence like emotional avoidance. The person becomes untouchable, unavailable, lost, and therefore mythologized. They are remembered not as they truly were, but as the projection of everything the avoidant secretly wants, but doesn't believe they can have. Emotional safety, connection without fear, intimacy without loss of self, and so the obsession takes root in fantasy, not in who that person is, but in what they meant. The avoidant may even start to idolize this person privately, not in the conscious way of admiration, but in the emotional sense of making them the exception. They were different. They might say to themselves, "It's too bad it couldn't work." And in that one statement is all the proof you need. It could have worked, but the avoidant didn't yet know how to stay present with the feeling it stirred. The pain of that truth, the recognition of self, sabotage, creates an ache that is difficult to resolve. And that ache, when left unattended, becomes obsession. This is not a surface-level craving. It is a soul-level echo, a longing not to return to the relationship, necessarily, but to return to the self that awakened in it. The avoidant may run, disconnect, distract, but something inside them remembers, and that memory becomes a compass, always pointing back to the place they were most alive, even if it scared them. Freedom, real freedom, does not come from cutting ties, blocking numbers, or burying emotions beneath the illusion of indifference. Freedom arises from awareness, from turning and facing the very thing we've been trying not to feel. For the avoidant, obsession is the echo of unprocessed emotion. It's the soul's reminder that something meaningful was left incomplete. And until they stop running from that echo and sit with it in stillness, they will remain caught in a cycle, avoiding, fixating, denying, then craving. The only way out is in, not into the person themselves, but into the feelings they stirred, the discomfort they revealed, and the parts of the self that have long gone ignored. Avoidance is never about the other person. It's a strategy to regulate overwhelming internal state. When someone evokes intimacy, it shakes the avoidant's nervous system like a sudden earthquake. Their response isn't to cling, it's to retreat, to go numb, to disappear. But the nervous system doesn't forget. And neither does the psyche. So even after the body walks away, the mind stays entangled. Obsession forms because the system is still trying to process what happened, still trying to bring resolution to a feeling that was too big to hold at the time. And in this way, the person becomes a placeholder for something deeper, emotional integration. Until that process is complete, they linger in the mind like a song with no final note. The way forward is not to chase the person, nor to deny they ever mattered. It is to return inward, to bring light to the parts of the psyche that shut down during the connection, to ask, what scared me, what was I protecting, what was I truly feeling beneath the surface? In this inquiry, freedom begins. Because freedom is not emotional distance, it is emotional clarity. It is knowing that the obsession was never really about them, but about the disowned pieces of yourself they illuminated. To reclaim those pieces is to begin the process of healing. This journey is not one of force or urgency. It's subtle. It happens in the quiet moments when the noise has died down and the distractions have faded. It's in the sigh you breathe when you realize you're still thinking about them, not with desperation, but with a strange sense of familiarity. That's not weakness, that's a signal, a call back to the truth of your emotional being. Avoidance cannot resolve what it's trying to suppress, but awareness can, and with awareness comes softness, space, and eventually the release that avoidance could never offer. And so, the avoidance obsession is not truly about another person, it is a mirror reflecting back their most tender, unclaimed truths. What they run from is not love, but the vulnerability it demands. What they fixate on is not the one who left, but the self that was momentarily revealed in that person's presence. To be free is not to forget, suppress, or outrun what was felt, but to sit with it honestly, to welcome it as a guide instead of a threat. For in the end, healing does not come through avoidance, it comes through presence, through the courage to feel fully, even what once overwhelmed. Only then can the obsession dissolve, not in the silence of suppression, but in the quiet power of understanding.